Welcome everybody to my talk, What a Front of the Front-End Developer Brings to Your Team. Sorry for the couple minutes starting late, but it's all right. It's 9 a.m. on the second day of a conference, so I figure people will probably still be trickling in because it's the second day of a conference. And that's always what happens, which is really cool. If you don't know me already, my name is Aubrey Sambor. I am a lead front-end developer. Also, let me know if I need to make this bigger or if you can't see it or anything like that. I can fix that. I live in Massachusetts. The weather is the same there as it is here, so this is nothing new. And I love the front of the front end. It's my first love. It's where I love spending my time, so I also love talking about it. If you want to talk with me online, I am mainly on Mastodon. You can find me at labyrinth.social/starshaped. I also have a website at aubreysambor.com, and you can find me on LinkedIn. So just hook up with me at any of those places. And of course, I have to mention, I'm looking for work. So if you need anybody who is a front of the front-end developer, I also do JavaScript, I do Drupal. Feel free to talk to me. I also love design systems and accessibility, so any of those things are right up my alley. So yeah, again, connect with me, talk with me after this. I'll be eating some tacos tonight, so yeah, just come on over and talk to me. So what am I going to be talking about today? I'm going to talk about what a front of the front-end developer is and how it's different from a thing called a back of the front-end developer, if you've heard that term. I'm going to talk about why our skills matter in today's world. I'm going to try to convince your team, I'm going to tell you how to convince your team that a front of the front-end developer belongs on your team. And I'm going to talk about how front of the front-end developers can work with other members of your team to build a great website, great project, great product, whatever you're building, how we can actually help out with that. So I'm going to go over some definitions. Again, what is a front of the front-end developer if you have never heard that term before? Well, here are a few things that a front of the front-end developer does. We keep up to date with CSS. We focus a lot on semantic HTML, which is using the right elements for the right job. We think of accessibility from the beginning of a project and not do it at the end. We know how to write JavaScript, but we write a lot more presentational JavaScript, kind of like show hide toggles or animations, things like that. And we also know when to use CSS instead of JavaScript to solve a problem. Because there are times where you'll see JavaScript being used for something that you can use CSS for. And a front of the front-end developer will know when to use the right tool for the job. Next up, what is the difference? What is a back of the front-end developer? Now, a back of the front-end developer also does some of the front-end skills that I talked about. But a lot of them focus more on framework, using frameworks to solve the problem, using React or Vue. And they might be more knowledgeable in build tool setup like Vite or Webpack or Rollup or whatever else is being used these days for build tools. Also, they would write or implement APIs that other people on the team would consume. So they kind of do more what you would think about traditional back-end development, only they mainly use JavaScript for this kind of work. And you might have heard of another term, full stack developers. And what's the difference between all the other things I just talked about in a full stack developer? Well, a full stack developer can handle responsibilities of both the front of the front end and the back of the front end. And they're equally proficient in both back and front end technologies. And of course, I had to say something at the end saying, is a magical unicorn that can do it all? Because that's the dream, right? That someone can do everything. But Brad Frost actually has a quote about full stack developers. And it says, in my experience, full stack developers always translates to programmers who can do front end code because they have to and it's easy. And there's a whole article called Full Stack Developers that Brad Frost wrote about this idea. And you can check that out in my slides. And my slides are available on my session page if you wanted to follow along with the slides there. So, why do our skills matter? Why do front of the front end skills matter? Well, here are some of the skills we offer. Like I said earlier, we offer modern CSS, We keep up to date with what's going on with CSS. We are really passionate about writing semantic HTML, and this goes hand in hand with knowledge of accessibility. And we also know how to write presentational JavaScript. And I'm going to go over each one of these skills and give some examples primarily in the CSS space, but I'll talk about some of the skills we offer. So first up, CSS. Front end developers, we keep up, like I said, with the latest and greatest in CSS. We keep up with what's coming up, what has just been released, which browsers support what browsers our clients support, so we know which CSS skills to use. So that is what we focus on with CSS. There is a modern CSS technique called text wrap balance. And I have an example of this. And let's see how easy it is for me to click on it. So I have an example here of a code pen of text wrap balance. On the screen I have two blue boxes right next to each other. The one on the left says testing text using text wrap balance in a container, and the other one says the same thing. The one on the left does not have the text wrap balance applied, so you can see that the word container is on the bottom by itself. So it looks really uneven. The first line is a lot longer than the second. In the box, the other box I have, it says the same thing, but the text is more evenly distributed because I'm using text wrap balance on this header. So now you see that there's not one word hanging on the bottom. So it looks a little more aesthetically pleasing. And it'll make your designers happy too, because this is the kind of thing they like to design. You've probably seen this kind of thing in your designs, and in the past you were like, I can't do that because there's no way to just have one word on the bottom. But with text wrap balance, you can do this kind of thing and make your designers happy, which is pretty cool. Next up is logical properties. These are a more concise way to write directional styles in your CSS. You can use these instead of having to do separate right to left styles for everything. So instead of writing margin right, you would write margin inline end, and that means instead of it being a left to right directional, now it'll say you want it at the end. And inline is what I think of as the horizontal axis, and then you write margin block end if you wanted to do a margin bottom. And that way, again, you don't have to rewrite, if the dir is set to right to left, you don't have to write whole separate styles. So logical properties are pretty cool for that. This is an older one, Flexbox and Grid. These have been around for a while now, and supported by all major browsers for a while now. But it's good to know when to use which one. I know in my experience, I like using Flexbox when it's a single dimension. If it's like a header, I like putting, if it's a header at the top of your page and you have the logo on one side and maybe your navigation on the other, I like using Flexbox to position those. I like using Grid when I'm building a whole whole layout, and I can use Grid when it's two-dimensional, when I'm trying to style columns and rows. So Grid is a good technique to use for that. And then another thing that's really good for that front of the front end developers do is knowing how to do transitions and animations using CSS. You could do a lot of that with CSS without reaching to JavaScript first. So it's good to know. It's good to know if you know your CSS to save some code and make your site more performant by not adding JavaScript when you don't need to. Next up is semantic HTML. We know how to use semantic HTML in a bunch of different scenarios. We know when to use a button versus a link, which is definitely a thing I've seen misused a lot when I've looked at different code. A button is used when you're actually submitting information. A link is used when you're trying to navigate from one page to another. And that's usually the thing I keep in mind when I'm trying to figure out whether or not you want to use a button or a link. I like using semantic HTML for details and summary elements. And I've got an example of details and summary later on in the talk. And we would know when to use the new popover API and we would know when to use the dialog element. These are new elements that are out there. Some of them aren't quite ready for prime time yet, but we're keeping an eye on these so we can start using them once like the dialog element is more accessible out of the box and things like that. But again, something we keep in mind. And of course, accessibility. We know the best ways to ensure accessibility when building a site. And I've got a code pen showing what not to do with buttons. That'll be my next example here. Building a button using semantic HTML. And on the screen here, I've got two buttons. I've got a header that says buttons versus links. And I have the first one that says I am a button, and then I have I am a link, and then I have a how not to build a button. Don't do this. And you can see the code on the side. The first one is just using the button element. So it's using like button class equals, I can't see the code from over here. That's the part that sucks, that you can't see it. But I know what I wrote there. But the first one is button, that's how you should write a button. The second example is doing a thing that I've seen a bunch in code, which is div role equals button, and having an on click to actually do the button action. You do not want to do that. That is not accessible, and it's just writing a whole bunch of code that you don't need to write because you can just use the button element. And the first one up there is the way you want to do it. And then you would knowing when to use ARIA in general. You want to use it only when you have to, and I would advise against not using ARIA if you don't have to. And if you want to hear more about ARIA, Kat will be having a talk later today about accessibility and going a little more in depth about that. We also know when to use color palettes that follow color contrast guidelines, and we know what these color contrast guidelines are for different sizes of text and things like that. And we also know how to test sites using multiple accessibility tools and manual testing, using keyboard navigation, using screen readers, doing all these tests to make sure that people who are using a mouse, they can use it too, but making sure everybody can use the site that you're building. Next is presentational JavaScript. Our knowledge of presentational JavaScript can add a lot of things to your site as well. We know how to write vanilla JavaScript to show and hide navigation dropdowns. We know how to use the Web Animations API if we need to use JavaScript for more complicated JavaScript that we can't be done using CSS yet. And implementing tooltips and modals. So we know how to use write this kind of JavaScript to do this kind of work. To summarize this, front-end developers add a lot to a team. Our skills matter to the success of your project. Next up, how to convince your team that our skills matter. Again, the importance of our skill set is our knowledge of accessibility and semantic HTML. I know I've been saying semantic HTML a lot, but it is really, really important, and it's sadly something I don't see a lot. I mean, you might have heard of the Figma sites that came out last week, where all the HTML that's generated by that tool right now was all divs. So it's not very semantic. There's a lot of other kind of weird little things that they were doing in there, but it's not going to be very accessible because everything they were doing was just div. So it's good to have a front-end developer who knows this skill set to help ensure that your application is going to be more accessible. Our in-depth knowledge of CSS can also save developers time, and we can add a more immersive experience with using some sort of animations. And we can also collaborate with a lot of different members of the team to build this successful site. I'm going to go over more accessibility in semantic HTML. Again, I just want to tell you how important this is. So accessibility is important because the WHO estimates that 15% of the world population live with some sort of disability. So it's important to build sites that people can use. The Web 8 Million from 2025, which just came out, I think, last week, this always has a list of what the biggest failures are when it comes to accessibility and what people can do better. This year's noted that 94.8% of home pages had detected WCAG2 failures, most from color contrast issues. That's always been the most the biggest thing that needs to be fixed on sites. And then also ARIA usage has increased 18.5% just in the last year. And it's noted that home pages with ARIA average 50% more detected errors than pages without. So if you're going to use ARIA, you really need to know how to use it, because if you don't know how to use it, it's going to make your site less accessible. So why is all this important? Well, people with disabilities use the web as much as everybody else, so they shouldn't be left out of the experience. So it's really important to be able to focus on making things as accessible as possible for as many people as you can, because the web is for everybody. And of course, I have to mention this, not making your site accessible can have a legal impact. Lawsuits against inaccessible websites have been increasing in recent years. This shouldn't be the main reason you make a site accessible, but it is important. And then I've got a note on the bottom. I've got a footnote on the bottom if you want to read more about what digital accessibility is and where I got this quote from. Also, a front-end developer, we would work to eliminate accessibility issues as much as we can, such as color contrast, empty links, missing form input labels, and other issues. So empty links, the form input labels, and the color contrast are kind of, I wouldn't say low-hanging fruit, but they are pretty pretty easy, quote-unquote, changes you can make to your site to actually increase the accessibility of it. So those are really important ones to fix. We would also know when to use ARIA and when to use semantic HTML to build a component, and this would avoid using extraneous ARIA, which might ultimately make our site less accessible. Next up, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some upcoming CSS techniques, because these are going to be really important for the future. One of them is using something called interpolate size instead of the web animations API to animate the details element. I don't know how many of you have tried animating the details element before interpolate size. If you tried opening and closing a details element, there wouldn't be any kind of nice transition or anything like that. But with interpolate size, which is now supported only in Chrome right now, you'll be able to add like a smoother transition with that. And I've got an example of that. I think it's this one. So I have an example of using a details and summary element using the Web Animations API, which I abbreviated here as WAAPI, and I have a second details element that is using the interpolate size. So you can see when I open this Web Animations API one, there is a smooth transition. This one is using JavaScript to do this functionality. And over here on the right side of the code, I've got all this JavaScript, which I think is down here. And there's a lot of JavaScript. I think this is the JavaScript. And there's a lot of JavaScript just to open and close, to add that effect to open and close this. With the interpolate size, it does the same thing, but it's just a CSS line that's in here somewhere. I think it's right here. Just make sure. Yes, it's just one line. Interpolate size equals whatever right here. What does it say? Allow keyword. Yeah, it's hard to have this all the way over here. I wish I could duplicate my code pens over here, but good enough. But this will make it a lot easier where you're not adding all this JavaScript just to open and close, just to add an effect to the details and summary to make it open fancy. So that will be a really nice thing to add to our skill set once it's supported in more browsers other than Chrome. So why are these CSS, these new things in CSS important? Again, knowing how to write CSS using the latest technologies can save coding time and reduce the size of your CSS files, and also reduce the size of your JavaScript if you're not having to use that Web Animations API. We can utilize new CSS techniques for animation, and transitions can make your site stand out, and that can drive more traffic to your site. New color techniques can help build design systems, colors faster, saving time when setting up your color system. And then I also think I missed a couple other CSS examples I have on this page. I got too excited about the web animations API one, so I have a couple other ones to show on this page as well. Another one that is going to be really useful is relative color syntax. This one's an easier way to implement colors in your design system using less code. And that one is over here. Yes. So this is relative color syntax. This one, on the screen right now, there are two rectangles. One says relative syntax, and the other one says relative syntax hue shift. The one on the left is green, and the one on the right is more of a purple. And I'm using relative color syntax to just change the color. I think it's HSL. Yeah, I'm using HSL. Let me go back over here. I'm using HSL to change the color. I'm updating the H in the HSL for the hue to change it from green to purple. And I'm just adding H plus, I think it's 200, to have it go around the color wheel to change the color. You can do the same kind of thing with saturation and lightness. Like if you're looking to generate a design system color palette that has a bunch of different shades of the same color, just with differences in lightness, you can do this same kind of math on the lightness part of HSL, and then you would have a whole color palette just doing that. So relative color syntax is a really cool thing to do if you're wanting to do that kind of thing in a design system. And then another really cool one is margin trim. And I'm going to see how easy it's going to be for me to show this. So this right here is, I'm using Vivaldi for my browser. And I'm trying to demonstrate margin trim. As you can see with my message on the top, it says, no, your browser doesn't support margin trim. And you can see, and on the bottom below that, I have a blue rectangle with 3 items in it, and there's more margin on the bottom than on the top. Now, what I usually do for this technique is with the list items, it's a list item, I would make the last list item have a margin bottom 0, margin block end 0. But that's kind of annoying to write. So margin trim, what you do is you put the margin trim on the container, and it will actually trim that bottom part. You can just say margin trim 0 or whatever. And I have this in Safari. Like, it's only supported in Safari right now, and I have an example in Safari. Just need to try to get my Safari to show, so I can show you what it looks like. So here is my Safari with margin trim. And this is in Safari. I have a message on the top that says, yay, your browser supports margin trim. And below that is a blue rectangle with 3 items. And this one does not have the extra margin on the bottom, because margin trim will actually cut that down, and you're able to do it that way. So once that's supported in browsers other than Safari, I think this one will be really useful. So we're not having to write things like the last child has a margin bottom of 0. Or the other technique I like using is doing li not last child, put the margin bottom. This way you can just put the margin trim on the container, and then you don't have to worry about it. And it'll be super, super nice once that's supported. Back to my slides. Back to where I was. All right, so we did all that. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is how front-end developers collaborate with your team. I think that still looks good. We have skill sets that complement other members of our teams. Some of us have design experience, so we can assist designers in building prototypes. Some of us have back of the front-end development experience as well as front of the front-end development experience, so we can help in with JavaScript framework updates. And some of us might have back-end development experience, so they can help implement the design that makes the most sense with the back end. I actually have all these experience. I have a wide variety of experience with things, so I've done design, back of the front-end development, and back-end development. So it has been really useful as a primarily front of the front-end developer to be able to go in and collaborate with other people on my team. So why is this important? Well, I could tell you how front of the front-end developers collaborate with others. Because again, I feel like this is the most important part of our job, is the collaboration we do with lots of other people on our teams. We work well, like I said, with designers, with back of the front end developers, back end developers, and of course we work well with project managers too. Again, there's a wall of text, sorry about that. Collaboration with designers. We work really well with designers because it helps the development process later on, especially if we're involved with the design process as soon as possible. I think it's really, really important for a front of the front end developer to be there at the start when a designer is starting to make their designs. We can go in and add some of our knowledge. We can talk about what things are feasible, what things are not in the design, and we'd be able to work together effectively to make a design that's actually something that is useful. And on the flip side, designers can sometimes bring new ideas to a front of the front end developer. There might be some things that we think aren't possible, but when we dig into it and do some research and talk to the designer, maybe we can do something. Maybe it would allow us to think a little outside the box and do something new that's also accessible and semantic. So it's nice to collaborate with designers who might be able to bring new ideas to a front of the front end developer. And I really like working with designers. It's a lot of fun. It's one of my favorite things to do. Collaboration with back of the front end developers. Again, a lot of back of the front end developers will do things like setting up tooling, API configuration, and writing more business logic than a front of the front end developer might write. And then on our side, front of the front end developers, we're going to want to ensure that any of the HTML that's generated by some of the things that back of the front end developers write are semantically correct. The JavaScript that they write is accessible, and we'd also write any CSS that they might not know how to write or we would want to help them out with. And collaboration with back-end developers. You see this a lot in the Drupal space in particular. Back-end developers can do module development, any kind of block plugin development, custom functions, and front of the front-end developers can go in and implement these in their Twig templates and make sure, again, that the HTML and everything is structured correctly. I've definitely worked a lot with back-end developers in Drupal on Drupal projects to ensure that any HTML that they do generate with their modules is more semantically correct. There's usually back and forth between how to do this in the best way. So it's really important to have somebody who has that HTML knowledge so that your HTML isn't all funky, that you're using the right semantic, you're using the right elements where you need to. And then on the other hand, we can help write some of the CSS that's in these modules for these back-end developers, and that's also really helpful. I know on a lot of projects I've worked on with a back-end developer in Drupal, I've been tagged in on the module development to be like, hey, you're the CSS person, come on in and write some CSS for this. And that's a lot of fun because I'd rather be doing it using my skill set so that the module looks pretty good and uses the correct CSS. And then, of course, collaborating with back-end developers using single directory components, if you're trying to do Storybook or anything like that, it's also really nice to work with back-end developers with that as well. And collaboration with project managers. We can help with the ticket creation, helping with definitions of done, ensuring accessibility testing actually happens. Because even if you're doing accessibility from the start of the project, it's also important to always do testing whenever you can with accessibility, no matter what you're building. So it's good to have that as part of your definition of done in your tickets. So it's good to collaborate with project managers to make sure that's there. And then we can, like I said earlier with designers, we can also get involved with the project early on. So we can be there also with the discovery process part of the project at the very beginning so that we can uncover some things and bring that to the project manager's attention when tickets are being made. So in conclusion for the collaboration, front of the front end developers can be useful at any part of the project, beginning to end, and we can collaborate effectively with every member of the team. So I'm going to wrap up here. And front of the front end developers are an important part. We have a unique skill set that integrates with the skill sets of other members of the team, including CSS, HTML, and accessibility. I feel like, again, those are really, really important skills to bring to a team Sometimes they're overlooked if there's not a front-end developer who really is passionate about these skills. I know I've definitely had to fight for especially accessibility on some projects because I find it very, very important. Semantic HTML too is also very important. And we bring value to your team because we keep up with these things like the latest in CSS, focusing on best practices, making sure that we're doing everything up to date with accessibility best practices, and we know how to write semantic HTML and know when to use ARIA and when not to. We also collaborate effectively with other members of the team, again, including designers, back of the front end developers, back end developers, and project managers. So I have a bunch of links if you want to read any more about anything I talked about. And also there's other links within the talk as well. And the slides are, again, on my session page on the MidCamp website, if you wanted to take a look at any of the links there. And if you need my contact information again, you can find me on Mastodon, you can go to my website, or you can add me on LinkedIn. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to connect with people. And that's it. Open to questions if anyone has any. Yeah, Mike?
I think the appeal of the unicorn full stack developer is that they can always be busy, right? They can work on the whole piece and see it through. But in the realistic sense, you have the back end and the front end developers. In your experience being a front end developer, what's the ideal way to collaborate so that either the back end person or the front end person is not just sitting there on their hands for a long time waiting for the other person to do their piece?
Yeah, the question was, how can the front of the front end developer and the back of the front end developer work together so that people aren't kind of twiddling their thumbs waiting for one person to work on something before they can get other things done? So that's kind of something, I'm trying to think of how that could go. I mean, there's always like setup things that a front of the front end developer can do in the meantime before the back of the back end developer finishes their part. Like we can do a lot of the setup of color palette generation, typography setup, things like that. So that's something that a front of the front end developer can do while a back of the front end developer is doing any kind of JavaScript tooling or pulling in APIs. Same with a back-end developer as well. If you're doing like a Drupal back-end, they can do a lot of that work while the front of the front-end developer does a lot of the initial setup. So that's what it's looked like on a lot of my projects. So yeah. Yeah, Kat.
I was also thinking, and you could repeat it, but I was also thinking helping to evaluate the modules that they're considering.
Yep.
That would be a good idea as well, especially for accessibility and usability.
Yeah, Kat suggested that another thing that a front of the front end developer can do is evaluating modules to make sure that that they're accessible enough, that the structure is correct, that the structure is useful, and things like that. So that's another thing that a front of the front end developer can do while the back end developers are doing the setup. Yeah.
When it comes to the cutting edge CSS and other features, would you recommend like baseline and progressive enhancement or another approach or like a balance to assess when to use them?
Yeah, the question was, when you're trying to evaluate using new CSS, do we use baseline or progressive enhancement just in case, like whatever the browser support is? I do advise using baseline to see. I usually like seeing baseline, I think at this point baseline, I want to say 2023. I'm trying to think which one has whatever the one that has in it is the one I like using, and I think that's 23. So yeah, you can have that as your standard if you are wanting to do that. Progressive enhancement or using app supports is also really good to use, depending on what you want to support. Again, this all depends on what your client wants to support. Like if they have to support Firefox, like ESR or something like that, the really old version of Firefox that's more of a long-term support, you might not be using a lot of the more up-to-date cutting-edge CSS. But if you're working on like an intranet and you know that everyone is using the same browser and all their browsers are always up-to-date, you'd be able to use more of these things. It's just going to depend on your use case, but progressive enhancement is a really good one. Talking about at supports is a really good one. So those are good things to add to this talk. So that's a really good suggestion. So thank you for that. Yeah.
What resources or websites or Slack groups are you following to keep up with CSS changes?
Let's see. I listen to the Shop Talk Show podcast. That's a good one. Syntax.fm has some tidbits as well. I belong to a bunch of different front-end discords. I belong to one called Front End Horse. They talk a lot about front-end development. I like the Log Rocket blog. They actually have a lot of really good examples. I can go back to my further reading. There's a bunch of blog posts here. You can see there's a Log Rocket blog. CSS Tricks is back, so they've had some really good articles recently about CSS. So anything like that. Front End Masters has a really good blog too. Mainly blogs is what I do. Web.dev has got a bunch of good articles if you're wanting more Chrome specific things or seeing what's going to come up. So that's pretty much what I do. Mainly blogs, a couple podcasts, a couple discords. And on Mastodon, of course. I follow a bunch of people on Mastodon. There's a lot of people on Blue Sky too, so you can find a lot of information that way. All right, any more questions? If not, then thank you very much for attending. And if you have any other questions later on, feel free to find me. I'm always willing to answer.